Hello, bakers. My name is Mark Flurka. I'm the Baked in Science podcast host for BAKERpedia, and this is your Forum Friday. With Forum Friday, Dr. Lynn and I get together to talk about some of the conversations that are happening in the baking industry professionals group. Dr. Lynn is busy on assignment this time, and so I'm flying it solo, and we'll try to cover off things for you as best as I can. First thing I'd like to start off with is a reminder to everyone that we have an amazing, informative, live, free, I repeat, free seminar coming up on October the 12th. Go to BAKERpedia.com and select Baker Community and Live Seminars, and you can sign up for the Objective Bread Measurement Seminar. And that is sponsored by KPM Analytics. This is going to be awesome. This is going to help give you so much insight into objective ways of measuring your breads and getting consistent results with that afterwards. Right? So now let's talk about what's happening in the forum. We continue to grow. Every week, it astonishes me how many new members we keep getting signed up every week. And so that is awesome. We are building a really great community, lots of different communication going on over all kinds of different things. One of the things that caught my eye is soft roll baking temperature, deck oven versus convection oven. And there are some differences, but not quite in the same manner as perhaps the author originally expected, right? On the surface, the main thing to consider is that with convection, you have rapid air movement. So that increases the friction on the surface of the baked goods. And the heat distribution is usually very, very even in convection, especially if it's a rotating rack oven. The convection ovens that are stationary, they still tend to have hot spots where you may have to rotate the product halfway through. And what I'm thinking of is the reach-in convection ovens in commercial kitchens that are often single, like they'll have, say, 5 shelves in it and stuff like that. But the rotating rack ovens, they're rotating, so there's nothing to rotate. Right? But as a rule of thumb, if you're baking at 375 in the deck oven, you probably want to bake, and that would be Fahrenheit, and that would likely translate into 350 degrees in the convection oven. Now, other things to keep in mind is how well the steam or moisture does or does not evaporate, right? In a deck oven, you have what is called a damper. And not all convection ovens have dampers. Some of them just have it constantly open, or it opens according to the amount of pressure created in the chamber. If there's a lot of steam, it pushes the damper open to let the steam out. With a deck oven, you can keep the damper closed to keep the steam in the oven. Now, this is done primarily for crusty breads, where you're trying to gelatinize the surface starch to get a nice thin, crispy crust. With soft rolls, we usually don't want a lot of steam, other than maybe in the beginning, just to not to give it steam, but to help keep the steam trapped so that it allows the bun to expand before it sets, right? So that it doesn't dry it out too quickly before it's finished expanding. And so most of the time with a deck oven, in my experience, has been that you would open the damper somewhere between 5 to 7 minutes after you've put the buns in the oven. So allow that steam to stay there. Then it's usually just a lever you pull, or on some of the technology ones these days, a button you push, and it opens the damper. And the damper is essentially a cavity or a hole, an opening usually in the back of the oven towards the top, and that opens to allows the steam to exhaust. Right. Sometimes you see it in open hood concepts. Other times it's vented directly outdoors and goes through a filtration system and so on, right? Having said that, with a deck oven, you may have different settings for top, bottom, and front. And so that with the deck oven, having the top heat higher than the bottom will depend on what you are baking on. If you're baking on a steel pan with a silicone mat, you're going to need more heat on the bottom. You'll have to have a higher setting on the bottom than on the top to get that heat through. If you're baking directly on the hearth with the buns, or directly on the hearth where you slide the buns with the silicone paper into the deck, then of course you need more even heat top and bottom, because it's more direct, and maybe even lower heat on the bottom. So it takes a little bit of experimenting, especially if it's a new oven. Do some bakes with it, figure out how it works before you're making 1,000 rolls with it, and make sure that you find a good setting that works for you. There's never one answer for all ovens. Each oven is somewhat unique, and you need to test a little bit and make sure that you get the settings to where you want them to be for consistent results. Another discussion going on is asking about improving volume in breads with either vital wheat gluten versus ascorbic acid. That would be like as different as saying, do you want more light with the sun or with the moon? Which the moon is just a reflection of the sun, right? Okay. So in that sense, vital wheat gluten is the protein that has the extensibility and resilience to capture the gas bubbles. So adding some vital wheat gluten and the right amount of water and mixing and everything else that goes along with that can help get you a little bit better volume, right? You may want to use ascorbic acid at the same time as that, or ascorbic acid in general in your baking. It will help somewhat with volume. It basically is an oxidizer. It helps get oxygen into the dough for the yeast to ferment and for the gluten to react with. So they're really not an either or. It's really more of a how much of each. And ascorbic acid is used on the flour ratio, and it can be as low as 30 parts per million. There is no actual legal limit, but good manufacturing practices suggest between 90 to 120 parts per million is the maximum. The most I most commonly see is 90, and those are usually on very specialty situations, right? And so that is something that ascorbic helps with fermentation more than actually volume per se, right? Another one is asking about is benzoyl peroxide stable in flour, or is this acne medication? Well, let me put it this way. Don't take bleached flour to treat your acne, right? That's not going to work, right? But it is in a sense, it is a similar type of chemical. Benzoyl peroxide is a bleaching agent. So when you use a cream that contains benzoyl peroxide on your acne, on your pimples, it is essentially bleaching that pimple area. So what it is doing is the bleach is being used to help kill off certain bacteria so that they cannot multiply, and then the infection can start to heal, and you won't have that little red bump anymore, right? With benzoyl peroxide in flour, it is used to change the pigment of the flour. As we all know, bleach is often used to make white clothes whiter because it basically alters the pigment in a small, low-level usage, right? Bleaching is not allowed in some countries, as there are concerns about potential of effects of our carcinogenic reaction. In other words, there are indicators that it may contribute towards causing cancer, but it is not definitive. So in many countries like North America, we still do use bleaching to make the flour whiter. So wheat flour is naturally a sort of creamy color, slightly off yellow or slightly off white with a yellowish kind of tinge to it, right? And what became very popular in the, I think it was around like 50s and 60s, is to have your white bread be really white. And to get that is, fermentation and enzyme active soy flours and things like that can help get some whiteness, but not as bright white as benzoyl peroxide. So when benzoyl peroxide is added to a wheat flour, it is in the form of a powder, and it's very, very low levels. Parts per million is what we use for that, and very low levels. And it needs to be combined with the flour, and it needs to sit for 24 hours. After those 24 hours, the flour becomes white. It doesn't become white instantly. It takes time for the reaction to take place. Now, as far as stability, it doesn't change back again. It stays white. Once it's made white by the bleach, it stays white. It's not a mold inhibitor or anything like that. It's not a preservative. It is used solely to make the flour look white for white breads. That is the main function, really the sole function. And it has no impact on functionality of the flour at all. Right. So in other words, with the popular move towards unbleached flour today is all about just not eating benzoyl peroxide. That's simple, right? So it is essentially, the answer is yes, because it's not unstable. All it does is bleach the flour, and the flour stays white. And now another question on, speaking of shelf life, a 4-week shelf life for packaged bread. Trying to copy a competitor request. Now, there's often a lot of discussions and conversations around this in terms of, well, why would you make a bread that lasts 4 weeks? I like to make my bread and sell it fresh on the shelf, and that your customer eats it today or tomorrow and comes back for more. And that is all fine and good when you have a local bakery to provide you with the breads that you are interested in. In some areas, in some countries, that isn't always the case. And if you're making a specialty bread variety that is in demand and not being made elsewhere, and this needs to be transported to other locations, that is where we need shelf life extension. And shelf life extension really amounts to 3 main things. The first one is in terms of soundness of the product, in that it's healthy and okay to eat, meaning no mold, no salmonella, no E. coli, no other microorganism growth that could in any way potentially be harmful to health. That's the number one important thing, right? Of course, mold is one of those things we can actually see visibly after some time when it starts growing, right? But it's actually there before we can see it. There are tests that can be done with that, right? The second thing is quality acceptability, things like softness, that it has a nice crust to it, or things. So crusty breads are one of those things that have a very short shelf life in terms of quality, because that crust disappears as the moisture from inside the bread and in the atmosphere migrates into the crust and takes that crispiness away. So sometimes you can refresh it by heating it up in an oven very quickly, right, and bringing that crust back. Right? But with other breads, it's usually mostly about the interior crumb, that it be nice and soft and a nice palatable softness to it. And the third thing is, of course, flavor. We don't want any off flavors to develop, whether they be from rancidity or other things that develop over time because of reactions of the ingredients, or just in terms of the quality and soundness of the ingredients, that they taste or smell foul, or they lose their appetizing flavor. So those are three important things. And now, if you're in a big country with low population density, let's say Canada, for example, or Australia, there are long distances between major population centers. Or if it's in one of the comments in the thread also is about in Indonesia, to get the product to some of the outlying islands, it has to go in a shipping container by boat. So this means it probably has to travel by truck to a rail yard or shipping yard of some kind, be transferred into a container. That container needs to be transferred onto a boat with a whole bunch of other containers. Then that boat has to float all the way down the ocean or the river or whatever to get to its destination. Everything has to be unloaded off of that boat. The container has to be sent to a warehouse where things are going to be unloaded and distributed, and then from the distributor into the store. And that can take anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, depending. I mean, it depends how great the distance is. If you're making something in Montreal and shipping it to Israel, well, you better make sure you have at least a 6-week shelf life, because it's going to take 4 weeks probably to get there. Right. Maybe even 5, right. And so on. So those are things to keep in mind. There's a lot that can be done, and it also always depends on what is your biggest problem with shelf life. What is your biggest battle? Is it the softness? Is it the mold, like in terms of inhibiting mold? Or is it flavor? And you need to address each of these individually. With mold inhibitors, there's lots of solutions in the market, whether it be calcium propionate or propionate, as some like to pronounce it, or things like one of our sponsors, Bartek, have a mold inhibitor that is a combination of acids and propionate, or even a clean label mold inhibitor that is made up of acids and works together with natural mold inhibitors like cultured wheat or cultured dextrose. And so there's lots of options. And of course, for softness, it could be monodiglycerides, it could be enzymes, it could be just fat in general, and all of those things. If you use fat and if you use a butter, well, then you also have to be aware of, or if it is something like a linseed oil or something like that, to use the fat. These are not oxidatively stable. So they could potentially go rancid very quick or develop off flavors before they are fully rancid. So a lot of things to consider there when you're trying to do a 4-week or longer shelf life, right? It doesn't make the bread a bad product. It is for a different purpose and application than when you are able to serve things fresh. Lastly, want to talk about a request for a good pizza dough that can last 5 days in cold storage. Wow. I would say that's kind of tough. And there you would also we would need more background as to, again, why. What is the actual problem you're trying to solve, right? If it is a matter of you just want to produce pizza dough once a week and put it in the fridge and make pizza from that all week, then I would suggest you may need to adjust your model slightly, your business model, so that you are able to make pizza dough tonight for tomorrow is the ideal situation most of the time. But to make it last for 5 days, that mainly comes down to making the dough cold. Use cold water, cold flour, all cold ingredients. Keep the dough as cool as possible. And you may need to use extra yeast, or you may need to use an encapsulated yeast of some type. But that gets very tricky, because you do need the yeast to start reacting. It's not an encapsulation with fat. It would be something with starch so that it just very slowly reacts. For example, using active dry yeast instead of instant dry yeast. And instead of activating it, you put the active yeast into the dough, and then over time, it'll slowly dissolve and work its way into the dough. But that will give you pockets of yeast. It will not be evenly distributed. So there's a downside in that. The main thing I would say is run the dough cold, increase the yeast probably by about 30%, and divide and round and put it into bags or containers that can be sealed so there is no air movement. You don't want any air moving across the dough, otherwise that will form a crust. And that can help get you to 5 days. The flavor on day 5 will be different from day 1 because the dough does not stop fermenting. You are only slowing it down to a very slow rate. So those are things you need to explore and understand what you're trying to accomplish and what you're willing to accept. And so a reminder again, our seminar coming up October 12th, head on over to BAKERpedia.com, Baking Community Live Seminars, and sign up. It's free. I always love when I go to Mexico. Hey, sir, come buy my stuff. It's almost free, right? Well, this is not almost free. It's completely free. And I'm going to be there too, because this is going to be a great seminar. And we'll see you all next month. And then keep the conversations coming. We enjoy them all. Bye, everybody.